He found an Apache woman collapsed in the snow. Hours later, she claimed half his land. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. On a bitterly cold winter day in the remote western frontier, John Miller, a seasoned rancher, was making his usual rounds on his property. His cattle were his only company, the snow-covered landscape stretching for miles with no signs of life. As he trudged through the snow, the wind biting through his coat, he spotted something unusual up ahead. A figure lay collapsed in the snow, her body barely visible against the white ground. John's heart skipped a beat as he hurried toward her, his boots crunching in the snow. He reached the woman and saw that she was unconscious, her skin pale from the cold, her breath shallow. Without thinking twice, John lifted her into his arms, carrying her back to his cabin, where he placed her by the fire to warm up. She was an Apache woman, her features sharp and proud, yet her current state was a stark contrast to her heritage. Her clothes were torn, and her body bore the marks of someone who had endured hardship. John worked quickly, stoking the fire and preparing a pot of hot coffee to try and revive her. Hours passed, and the storm outside continued to rage, but the woman did not stir. Just when John was about to give up, she suddenly gasped for air, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him with confusion, then fear. "Where am I?" she whispered hoarsely. John offered a reassuring smile. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm. "I found you out in the snow. You've been unconscious for hours." The woman looked around, taking in her surroundings before her gaze fixed on John. "Why did you help me?" she asked. John's expression softened. "It's just what you do for someone in need." She nodded slowly, clearly in pain, but there was something in her eyes that made John uneasy. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something else, something darker. Over the course of the next few days, as the storm subsided, the woman, whose name was Ayanna, recovered enough to speak more freely. She told John she was from a nearby Apache tribe, one that had been displaced from their land by encroaching settlers. Her people had been scattered, and she had been traveling alone, hoping to find shelter. But there was a quiet tension between them. Ayanna seemed grateful for John's help, yet she was distant, as if calculating something behind her words. John tried to brush off the feeling, telling himself she was just wary, but deep down, he couldn't shake the sense that something was amiss. It wasn't until the fourth day, when John went out to check on his livestock, that things took a turn. He returned to find Ayanna standing outside, her arms crossed, her face set in a determined expression. "I need to speak with you," she said, her tone businesslike. John raised an eyebrow, wondering what this was about. "What's going on?" Ayanna met his gaze with a level of intensity that caught him off guard. "I'm not here by accident," she said. "I know you don't understand yet, but the land you live on, it's not just yours. It belongs to my people. And now, it belongs to me." John stood frozen for a moment, staring at Ayanna as her words hung in the air. She was calm, almost eerily so, but there was a fire in her eyes that made John's skin prickle. "It belongs to me," he repeated, trying to make sense of what she was saying. The wind howled outside, the storm still not fully gone, but the cold he felt now wasn't from the weather. It was from the weight of Ayanna's claim. She nodded slowly, her arms still crossed. "I know it's hard to understand, but this land, your cattle, your home, it's part of what was once Apache territory. And as the rightful heir of my people, I claim it." John could hardly believe what he was hearing. This was his land, his home, the place he had worked so hard to carve out for himself. "That's not how it works," he muttered, shaking his head. "I've worked this land for years. My father did before me. It's mine." Ayanna's eyes softened, but there was a glint of something resolute beneath her gaze. "Your father might have worked this land, but it was never truly his. You've been allowed to live here, to use the land, but that does not make it yours. I am the one who will rebuild what was lost." John's stomach churned. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything. He had lived alone for so long, had built his life from the ground up, and now a stranger, an Apache woman, was telling him that his home, his livelihood, belonged to her people. You don't know what it's like out here, John said, his voice tight. You don't understand what I've had to go through to survive. Ayana's expression was unreadable. I understand more than you think. My people have suffered for generations, forced to give up their land, their way of life, while others took what was not theirs. But now, things will be different. This land is part of my inheritance. And you will be a part of it. John felt a knot form in his chest. This wasn't just about land. It was about a history, a heritage that was far older and more complicated than his own. He had never been part of that world, had always seen the Apache as people to be avoided, kept at arm's length. But Ayana wasn't like the stories he had heard. She was strong, determined, and deeply connected to something that John could barely begin to comprehend. So what do you want from me? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ayana stepped closer, her presence overwhelming yet not threatening. I don't want to take everything from you, John, she said softly. But you must understand that my people have lost everything. And now, I am asking for what is rightfully mine. John was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always believed that hard work and determination were all that mattered, that he could build his future with his own hands. But now, with Ayana's claim over his land, he had to wonder if he was wrong. I don't know what to say, he admitted, his voice thick with confusion. Ayana gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. You don't have to say anything, John. I just need you to understand. My people need this land, and we will make it ours again. John felt a surge of frustration, mixed with something else. Guilt, maybe, or fear, but he didn't show it. Instead, he turned his back to her, walking over to the window and staring out at the snow-covered plains. For the first time in years, John felt as though his life was out of his control. Everything he had worked for, everything he thought he knew, was slipping away. And yet, something inside him told him that Ayana's arrival was not the end. It was only the beginning. What happened next would depend on what choices he made. But for now, all he could do was stand there, staring out at the vast emptiness before him, wondering what would become of the land he had called his own. John stood by the window for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. The storm outside had subsided, but the storm within him was just beginning. Ayana's words echoed in his mind, each one more troubling than the last. She was claiming what he had worked for his entire life. The land, the cattle, the home he had built, it was all under threat now, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But deep down, something told him Ayana wasn't here just to take. There was more to her claim, more to her story, and John was beginning to realize that her arrival was not a coincidence. It was a reckoning. Slowly, he turned away from the window, his gaze locking with Ayana's. She hadn't moved since their conversation began, standing still, waiting for him to react. Her posture was confident, unshaken, but there was a glimmer of something else in her eyes, a recognition of the weight of what she had asked. I don't know what you expect from me, John said finally, his voice rough, but steady. This land is mine. I earned it, just like my father did before me. What do you want from me, Ayana? Ayana's expression softened, but only slightly. I don't want to take it from you, John, she said, her voice calm, yet filled with a quiet strength. I want to rebuild what was lost. My people have been scattered, displaced for too long. This land, it's not just about soil and cattle. It's about history, survival, and reclaiming what was stolen. John was silent for a moment, processing her words. He understood the pain in her voice, the loss she had endured, but it didn't make her claim any easier to accept. He had worked every day of his life to keep this land, to make something of himself in a world that had always felt unforgiving. Now, here she was, asking for a piece of it, not out of malice, but because it was part of her legacy. So, you want me to give up everything I've built? He asked, trying to keep the bitterness from his voice. Just like that. Ayana stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. I don't expect you to give it up easily, she said, her tone now softer, almost sympathetic. I understand your pride, your struggle. But what you have here, John, isn't just your own. It belongs to more than just you. It belongs to the land, to the people who were here long before any settler ever set foot. John looked down at his hands, calloused from years of hard labor. He had spent so many years building this life, trying to prove himself, trying to make something that would stand the test of time. And now, Ayana was asking him to tear it all down, to hand it over to someone else. But he couldn't. Not without a fight. You want to rebuild what was lost, John said, his voice growing stronger. But I'm not just going to hand over my home to you. Not without a reason. Not without understanding what this really means. Ayanna studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face for something. Then, with a small nod, she spoke. I don't expect you to give in so easily, she said. But I will not leave until this is settled. My people need this land, John, and I will do whatever it takes to make sure it is returned to them. John's heart raced, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He knew she wasn't backing down, and that made everything harder. He had no choice but to make a decision, and soon. He could fight, hold on to his land, and risk everything. Or he could listen, try to understand Ayanna's point of view, and see where that led him. The uncertainty gnawed at him, and he realized that this moment would shape the rest of his life. Whatever happened next, it would change everything. I don't know if I can give you what you want, John said, his voice rough. But I won't just turn you away. We'll talk. We'll figure this out. Ayanna nodded, her face unreadable, but there was a flicker of something. Hope, maybe there. Thank you, she said quietly. That's all I ask. John turned and walked toward the door, his mind still spinning. He had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. John woke up the next morning, the light from the early dawn creeping through the cracks in the cabin's wooden walls. The storm had finally passed, and with it, the silence that had settled in the air. He hadn't slept much the night before. The conversation with Ayanna had kept his mind racing, turning over and over in his thoughts. Her words, her claim to the land, still echoed in his head. He had agreed to speak with her more, to try to find a solution. But what solution was there? He had worked for years to build what he had, and now it seemed like it was slipping through his fingers. As he stepped outside, the crisp morning air hit his face, and he saw Ayanna standing by the barn, her silhouette framed against the backdrop of the snow-covered plains. She was still here. Of course, she was. She had no intention of leaving until she got what she wanted. He walked over to her, his boots crunching in the snow. She didn't turn around until he was only a few feet away. I didn't expect you to be up so early, John said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. Ayanna gave him a small, almost knowing smile. I don't sleep much, she replied. Not until I'm sure that what I came for is within reach. John stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing. I told you we'd talk, he said, but I'm not going to just give you what you want. Not without understanding the full picture. Ayanna nodded, her expression serious. I understand, and I will explain it to you, John. I know this is hard, but my people need this land. You need to understand that this isn't just about property. It's about survival, about reclaiming what was lost. John's chest tightened. He had heard those words before, about survival, about loss, but he had never really understood what they meant. His life had been about work, about sweat and blood, and making a living. But Ayanna was talking about something deeper, something that went beyond the surface. So what do you want me to do? John asked, his voice quieter now. Do you want me to just hand everything over? Ayanna turned to face him fully now, her posture unwavering. No, John, I don't want you to hand it over. But I do want you to understand why this is so important. My people have been pushed off this land for generations. We have been forced to give up everything we knew, everything that was ours. And now, I'm asking for a chance to rebuild that. I'm asking for a chance to restore what was taken. John felt a knot in his stomach. Her words were like a weight, pressing down on him. But he still wasn't ready to give up. He had fought for everything he had, and he wasn't ready to lose it just because of some claim. And if I don't agree, he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Ayanna didn't flinch. Then we will have to go to war for it, she said simply. John blinked in surprise, but Ayanna's tone was calm, almost resigned. I don't want that, she added quickly. But I won't back down. My people need this land. John stood there for a long time, thinking. He couldn't deny the truth in her words. He had heard stories of the hardships faced by Native Americans, of the land they had lost, and of the injustices they had suffered. But he had never imagined that he would be a part of that history, that his life would somehow be connected to it. I didn't ask for this, John muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Ayanna. No one ever does, she replied quietly. But now you are part of it, whether you want to be or not. John's mind raced as he looked out over the land. This was his home, his life. But Ayanna's claim, her reason for being here, it was real. And deep down, John knew he couldn't ignore it forever. I'll give you a chance, he said finally, his voice firm. But this will not be easy. You understand that, right? Ayanna nodded. I understand, John. And I'm not asking for it to be easy. There was a long pause between them before Ayanna spoke again. I want to help you, John. But first, you have to help me. The words hung in the air, and John felt the weight of them. What could she possibly need from him? And what would that mean for his future, for the future of his land? What do you need? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ayanna looked at him, her eyes steady and unwavering. I need you to stand with me, to make sure that what we are doing here is not just about land, but about justice. John's heart skipped a beat. Justice. He had heard that word all his life, but he had never understood it like this before. The choices ahead of him weren't just about land or cattle, they were about something far greater. And for the first time, John wondered if he was ready to face it. John's mind raced as Ayanna's words echoed in his ears. He hadn't expected this conversation to take such a turn. She was asking him to stand with her, to fight for something greater than land, to fight for justice. But what did that mean for him? He had spent his life working this land, building a future he could be proud of. And now, Ayanna was telling him it wasn't just his land. It was part of a history that stretched far beyond him. He walked back to the cabin, his thoughts in turmoil. As he entered, he heard the creaking of the door behind him, and Ayanna followed him inside. The warmth from the fire did little to ease the coldness creeping into his chest. He turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. What does justice look like to you? He asked, his voice tight. Ayanna stood there for a moment, her expression unreadable. Justice isn't about taking what's mine, she said, her voice calm, yet there was an intensity to it. It's about making sure my people are seen, that what was taken from them is returned. It's about righting the wrongs that have been done to us for generations. John shook his head slowly. I understand your pain, Ayanna, but it's hard to just hand over everything I've worked for. Ayanna stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. I don't want you to just hand it over. I want you to understand why it's important. This land was once ours, but it was taken by force. We lost everything, and for years, we've had nothing but scraps left behind. I'm asking you to stand with me, not because I want to take from you, but because it's time for the land to be restored to those who were meant to protect it. John's chest tightened as he listened to her. He had heard the stories of the Apache, of their battles, their losses, but he had never truly understood the depth of it. His whole life had been spent in survival mode, fighting for every inch of his land, his home. And now, Ayanna was asking him to fight for something bigger than himself, something he had never considered. What if I can't give it to you? John asked quietly, the weight of the question hanging in the air. What if I can't just walk away from everything I've built? Ayanna's gaze softened, and for the first time, John saw the vulnerability in her eyes. I'm not asking you to walk away, she said gently. I'm asking you to help me rebuild, to help me create something that honors what was lost. We can work together, John. This doesn't have to be a fight. John looked at her, his heart heavy with the decision he had to make. He had never been good at sharing, especially when it came to something as personal as his land. But there was something about Ayanna, about the way she spoke of her people, that made him wonder if he could find a way to make this work. I don't know if I can do this, John admitted, his voice barely a whisper. But I can't ignore what you're saying either. Ayanna smiled softly, the first real smile John had seen from her. That's all I'm asking for, John. A chance to rebuild what was lost and to stand together. John stared at her for a long moment, trying to make sense of it all. His mind was still reeling, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about something deeper, something that could change the course of their futures. All right, John said finally, his voice steady. I'll help you, but we do this my way. We'll talk to the others. We'll figure out what needs to be done. Ayanna nodded, her expression serious, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Thank you, John. That's all I need. John felt a sense of relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by a deep sense of responsibility. He had agreed to help Ayanna, but he didn't know where it would lead. He didn't know if he was ready for what was coming, but he knew one thing. His life would never be the same again. The next few days were filled with tense silence. John had agreed to help Ayanna, but now that the decision had been made, the weight of it settled heavily on his shoulders. He had no idea how this would play out. but there was a nagging feeling that he was on the cusp of something far larger than either of them understood. John spent his days working the land, tending to his cattle, but his thoughts often drifted to Ayanna and the future she was asking him to share. He had to admit that something in her had moved him. There was strength in her, a quiet determination that matched his own. But how far was he willing to go to help her? The days were growing colder, and with the approaching winter, there was an urgency to their plans. They needed to move quickly if they were going to have any hope of succeeding. One afternoon, as John was finishing up his chores, Ayanna appeared in the distance, walking toward him with a steady, purposeful gait. She looked different now, not just as a woman seeking land, but as someone who was ready to lead. She was no longer the vulnerable figure who had collapsed in the snow. She was resolute, her gaze firm as she approached. "We need to talk," she said when she reached him, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it. John looked at her, his brow furrowing. "About what?" he asked. "We've already made our decision." "Not yet," she replied. "We've made a step, but now we need to plan the next one. This land, it's not just about us. If we're going to do this right, we need to bring the others in." John's stomach churned at the thought. He had agreed to help Ayanna, but what did that mean for the rest of the ranchers, for the settlers around him? He had worked so hard to make a life here, to establish his place in this land. How would they react to the news that Ayanna was claiming it as her own? "You think they'll just hand over their land?" John asked, the frustration clear in his voice. "They're not going to just give up everything they've worked for." Ayanna met his gaze steadily, unwavering. "No, they won't. But we can't back down now. My people have been pushed aside for too long. We're not asking for their land. We're asking for what was already ours." John sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had agreed to this, but the reality was starting to set in. This wasn't going to be easy. Ayanna was right. They couldn't back down. But what would that mean for him? "You're asking a lot," he muttered, his voice quiet. "I know," Ayanna said softly. "But I'm asking you to stand with me. Together, we can make this happen." John looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since he had agreed to help. She wasn't asking for just a piece of land. She was asking for justice. And somewhere deep inside, John knew that this was bigger than him. This wasn't just about his ranch or her claim. It was about something far more important. "All right," he said finally, his voice firm. "What's the plan?" Ayanna smiled, a small, determined smile. "We need to gather the other Apache tribes, to show them that we can rebuild together. But we also need to convince the settlers here that this isn't just about taking. It's about restoring what's been lost." John nodded slowly, absorbing her words. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose beyond his own survival. They had a long road ahead, and he knew there would be resistance. But with Ayanna by his side, he wasn't sure he could back down. "All right," he said again, more to himself than to her. "Let's do this." That evening, as they sat by the fire, John and Ayanna began to make their plans. They would travel to the nearby towns, speak to the other tribes, and try to rally support. But the hardest part would be talking to the settlers, the people who lived and worked in the same areas John had claimed as his own. He didn't know how they would react, but Ayanna's determination gave him a sense of hope. They weren't alone. John had a feeling this was just the beginning, but whatever came next, he knew that he had made the right choice. They would fight for something bigger than themselves, and that was a fight worth taking on. The next few days were a blur of activity. John and Ayanna traveled from ranch to ranch, from settlement to settlement, speaking to anyone who would listen. Word of their efforts spread quickly, and soon, they found themselves at the heart of a growing movement. But not everyone was on their side. As they made their way through the small towns, it became clear that not all settlers were willing to stand with them. There were whispers of resistance, of anger at the idea that someone could come in and claim what they had worked so hard for. John felt the tension rise with every conversation, every meeting. Some people were open to their message, but others were staunch in their refusal to even consider the idea. John had seen this kind of resistance before, the kind that came from fear of change, fear of losing what they thought was rightfully theirs. But Ayanna remained calm, never wavering in her resolve. She knew what needed to be done, and she wasn't going to back down. They arrived at the last ranch on their list, an old, weathered place that had been in the same family for generations. The man who owned it, Tom Green, was a gruff, no-nonsense type, and John had heard stories about him. He was a man of few words, but those words were always direct. As they approached, Tom was already standing by the gate, his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on them. "I've heard the rumors," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're here to ask for my land, aren't you?" John nodded, though it felt like a weight in his chest. "We're not here to take anything," he said. "We're asking for a chance to make things right." Tom's eyes flickered to Ayanna, and then back to John. "I don't know what you're talking about," Tom replied, his tone sharp. "This is my land. My family worked it for years. You think just because you show up with some fancy talk that you can take it?" John took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. This was the moment he had been dreading. The resistance, the anger, it was all coming to a head. "It's not about taking anything," John said, his voice steady but firm. "It's about understanding. It's about justice. Ayanna's people were here long before any of us. They've been wronged, and we're asking for a chance to make it right." Tom didn't say anything for a long time, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Ayanna. She stood tall beside John, her gaze unwavering. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tom spoke again. "You think you're going to change things?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "You think you can make everyone see what you see? It's not that simple." Ayanna stepped forward, her voice calm and clear. "I'm not asking for everyone to understand," she said. "I'm asking for a chance to rebuild, to restore what was lost. My people have suffered for too long. I'm not asking for pity. I'm asking for justice." Tom was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Ayanna. John could see the conflict in his eyes, the hesitation. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, Tom spoke. "I've seen what your people have been through," he said quietly. "I've heard the stories. But I don't know if I'm ready to give up my land. It's all I've got." John's heart sank. This was the moment he had feared. The moment when the fight would either begin or end. But Ayanna didn't flinch. "I don't want to take your land, Tom," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I want to build something with it. Something that can help us all. You don't have to give it all up. Just give us the chance to prove that this can work. For all of us." There was a long silence. John watched Tom closely, unsure of what was going to happen next. Finally, Tom let out a long sigh and shook his head. "I don't know," he muttered, almost to himself. "I don't know if I can trust it." But then, he looked at Ayanna, really looked at her, and something in his expression changed. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice quieter now. "Maybe it's time for a change. But don't expect it to be easy. I'll need to talk to the others, and it's going to take time. But I'm willing to listen." Ayanna nodded, a small but determined smile crossing her face. "That's all we ask, Tom. A chance." As they left the ranch that evening, John felt a weight lift from his chest. They had made progress. It wasn't a win yet, but it was a step forward. They still had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time, John felt like they might just have a chance to make this work. And as they rode into the setting sun, the feeling of uncertainty was replaced by something else: hope. The days that followed were filled with both uncertainty and resolve. John and Ayanna traveled to several neighboring settlements, speaking with ranchers and tribes alike. Some were willing to listen, others remained skeptical, and a few outright rejected their message. But despite the resistance, they could feel a shift in the air, a shift that came with small victories. Every conversation, no matter how difficult, was a step towards something larger, something that might finally bring change. The tension between the settlers and the Apache was thick, and though the road ahead was unclear, one thing was becoming evident. People were beginning to understand. But the true test was yet to come. Weeks later, as the first snow began to blanket the land once more, John and Ayanna were called to a meeting. It was to be held at the town hall, a place where both settlers and Native Americans would gather. This would be their chance to convince everyone, once and for all, that their vision could work. John was uneasy, unsure of what to expect. He had been to meetings like this before, and they rarely ended well. His heart raced as they approached the building, its wooden walls weathered from years of use. The town hall was packed, the room buzzing with murmurs of conversation. At the front of the room stood a group of settlers, their faces hard and skeptical. John knew they wouldn't make this easy. Ayanna stood tall beside him, her expression calm, but her eyes spoke of something much deeper. A determination, a belief that this was their moment, the moment that would define everything. John took a deep breath as the room fell silent. A man stepped forward from the settler's side, a rancher with graying hair, and a stern look. "We've heard your side," he said, his voice rough. "But we've got our own concerns. You come here asking for land, asking for rights that don't belong to you. How do you expect us to just hand over what we've worked for?" Ayanna met his gaze without hesitation. "I don't ask for your sympathy," she said, her voice steady. "I ask for justice. My people have been denied what is rightfully ours for too long. This land, it's part of our history, our heritage. We don't want to take what's yours. We want to rebuild, to restore what was lost." The rancher frowned, his gaze flicking to the other settlers in the room. They were waiting for his response, looking to him for guidance. Ayanna's words had hit a nerve, but they were not enough to convince him yet. "Rebuild?" the rancher scoffed. "You can't just come in here and expect to take over. We've worked this land for generations. What makes you think we'll just give it up?" John stepped forward then, his voice firm but calm. "We're not asking you to give up everything," he said. "But we are asking for a chance. A chance to heal the wounds that have been festering for too long. We're asking for your understanding, not your pity." The room was quiet for a long moment. John could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the skepticism hanging thick in the air. Then, after what felt like an eternity, another voice spoke up from the back of the room. "Maybe they're right," an older woman said, her voice soft but clear. "Maybe it's time for us to listen. We've held on to these lands, but at what cost? How much longer can we keep fighting when there's no real peace?" The murmurs in the room grew louder. Some of the settlers exchanged uneasy glances, others seemed to soften. Ayanna looked at John, her expression unreadable, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She wasn't backing down, and neither was he. Slowly, more voices began to speak up. Some were reluctant, others uncertain, but the tide was shifting. John could feel it, the change in the air. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was happening. After what seemed like hours, the rancher who had spoken earlier stepped forward again. His face was hard, but there was something else in his eyes now, something like understanding. "I don't know if this will work," he said, his voice quieter now, "but I'm willing to give you a chance." John and Ayanna exchanged a glance. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was the first step towards something that might be. "That's all we ask," Ayanna said, her voice soft but firm. The room was silent for a moment, and then, one by one, the settlers began to nod, offering their agreement. It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. The seeds of change had been planted, and now it was up to them to nurture them. As the meeting ended, John stepped outside into the cold, the weight of the moment settling over him. They had made progress, but there was still a long way to go. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, John felt like there was hope. With Ayanna at his side, he believed they could rebuild, that they could make this work. Together, they had started something bigger than themselves, and John knew that whatever came next, they would face it as one. The months that followed were a testament to their efforts. John and Ayanna worked tirelessly, meeting with settlers and tribes, holding discussions, and navigating the delicate balance of trust and tension. The road was far from easy, and each day brought new challenges, but the determination they shared fueled their progress. Slowly, but surely, the settlers who had once been so opposed to their plan began to soften. John's influence and Ayanna's resolve won over more hearts than they had ever expected. They didn't just want to claim the land. They wanted to heal the rift that had divided their people for so long. Ayanna spoke of her people's history, the hardships they endured, and their rightful place on the land. The settlers listened, some reluctantly, but many with growing empathy. John, for the first time in his life, saw the world through a different lens. It wasn't just about land or ownership. It was about legacy, history, and the future they could build together. One by one, the towns and ranches began to make peace with the idea of sharing the land. Not all of them agreed at first, but slowly, Ayanna's vision of a shared future began to take root. John helped bridge the gap, his understanding of both worlds allowing him to mediate the difficult conversations. It wasn't easy. There were still disagreements, misunderstandings, and moments of anger, but John could see the change taking shape. The land was slowly being restored, not just to Ayanna's people, but to the settlers who had worked it for so long. They began to understand the importance of shared stewardship, and how working together could yield far greater rewards than fighting over what they thought was rightfully theirs. The turning point came when John and Ayanna brought together the leaders of both the settlers and the Apache tribes. The atmosphere was tense as they sat around the table, but there was a sense of something else in the air: hope. This was the moment they had been working toward, the moment where they could decide whether the future would be one of continued conflict or one of collaboration. As they sat in the town hall, John spoke first. "We've all worked hard to get here," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This land, this place, belongs to all of us. But more than that, it belongs to the future we can create together." Ayanna's eyes were fixed on him, and when it was her turn to speak, her voice rang with strength. "We're not here to take what's yours. We're here to build something together. My people have suffered, but we're not asking for pity. We're asking for a chance." The room was silent for a moment as everyone took in her words. Then, to John's surprise, one of the settlers stood. It was Tom Green, the rancher who had been so reluctant at the beginning. He had changed. "I don't know if I fully understand everything," he said, his voice rough, "but I've seen the change in my own land, in the way my neighbors are thinking. Maybe it's time to stop fighting and start building something new." Slowly, one by one, the others began to nod. The tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by the tentative beginnings of a new understanding. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was progress. The meeting ended with a promise to continue working together, to find solutions that respected both the settlers' rights and the Apache's claim to the land. As John and Ayanna walked outside, the evening air was cool, but there was warmth between them, an unspoken bond formed through shared struggle and triumph. John looked at Ayanna, his heart swelling with pride. They had done it. They had started something that could change everything. It wouldn't be simple, and it wouldn't be without hardship, but for the first time, John believed in the possibility of a future where the land could be shared, where history could be healed. "We did it," he said quietly. Ayanna nodded, her gaze steady. "No, John, we're just getting started." The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, it seemed worth walking together. In this captivating tale of Western stories, a rancher's life is turned upside down when an Apache woman claims a piece of his land, setting the stage for an epic journey of justice, healing, and difficult decisions. As the story unfolds, we witness the battle between ownership and legacy, where the line between right and wrong is blurred. This is not just about land. It's about the reclaiming of history, trust, and the spirit of the American West. The tension between settlers and indigenous peoples builds as they strive to understand each other's struggles, making this one of the most poignant Western stories of our time. Through tense meetings, heated exchanges, and the gradual shift from hostility to cooperation, the characters confront their fears and prejudices, ultimately deciding whether they will let go of their past in order to build a better future. In these Western stories, we see the resilience of people who are fighting not just for land, but for justice and equality. The road to peace is long and filled with challenges, but the perseverance shown by the main characters shows that even in the harshest of times, understanding and compromise can change the course of history. The twists and turns of this story serve as a reminder that Western stories are not just about cowboys and Indians, but about the complex relationships that shape America's past and future.